If you own your home, you probably assume one thing without ever really thinking about it, that you decide when you leave. In December 2022, a man named Mark Clifton sold his Miami condo for just over $500,000. He thought he had timed it well. 3 years later, his old neighbors, same building, same views, some of them 2 floors up, were signing for more than $1.5 million. Nobody ever explained why the price kept climbing. The buyer was not a developer. It was not a name anyone could look up. It was a chain of anonymous Delaware companies, paying all cash and asking no questions. And by the time anyone pieced together who was behind them, all 138 apartments in that tower had quietly changed hands. The building is still standing today. It will not be for much longer, because the man who bought it never wanted to live there. He spent $125 million for the right to erase it. The tower's called the Solaris, 22 stories, sitting right in the middle of Brickell, Miami's financial district. 138 units, ordinary people in an ordinary building that happened to be standing on extraordinary land. In late 2022, the letters started arriving. An offer, cash, above asking, from a limited liability company nobody had heard of, registered in Delaware, managed by a name that meant nothing to anyone who bothered to look it up. Some owners said yes straight away. Clifton was one of them. Then, the next offer came in higher, and the one after that, higher still. If you have ever sold anything, you know the feeling that follows. The quiet dread that you moved too early. The people still holding units at the Solaris started doing arithmetic they did not enjoy. What made it disorienting was not the money, it was the silence. Units went dark. Neighbors stopped appearing in the lobby. Some sellers were quietly offered leasebacks at below market rent, allowed to keep living in apartments they no longer owned, which meant the building could empty out on paper while still looking full from the street. There was no announcement, no press release, no developer's name on a sign. By November 2024, when a trade publication first managed to trace the purchases back to a single billionaire, nearly half the building had already sold to a cluster of near-identically named Delaware companies sharing a single manager. The residents found out from a newspaper. Just a slow, patient accumulation that nobody living inside it could see the shape of. And this is the part that gets me. Every person in that building was making the biggest financial decision of their life, with less information than the person sitting across the table. They were not negotiating. They were being moved, one at a time, across a board they could not see. To understand why the offers kept rising, you have to understand what was waiting at the end of the process. Florida Statute 718.117, the Condominium Termination Law. It says that if the holders of 80% of a building's voting interests approve a plan of termination, and no more than 10% formally object, the condominium can be dissolved. The building stops being a condominium. The remaining owners are bought out whether they agreed to it or not. That law was written for a humane reason. After 2007, Florida had hundreds of half-empty, structurally failing condo towers that a single holdout could trap in limbo forever. But a rule built to rescue dying buildings works just as well on healthy ones. And notice where that process ends. A terminated condominium does not get repaired or refurbished or handed to new owners. It gets taken down. Here is the mechanism, and it is the whole story. A buyer does not need to reach 80% to win. He only needs the owners to understand that he could. Because the moment you realize your neighbors are selling, and that at 80% the decision stops being yours, holding out is no longer a negotiation. It is a bet. You are wagering that a man with roughly $50 billion will lose patience before you run out of nerve. Almost nobody takes that bet. Call it the 80% gun. It never has to be fired. It just has to be loaded and visible and pointed at a building full of people who did nothing wrong. For 3.5 years, nobody could prove who was behind the shell companies. Then, in June 2026, At a Bisno Real Estate Summit, Citadel's chief workplace officer, Paul Dara, said it out loud. The buyer was Ken Griffin, founder of Citadel, the hedge fund he started in 1990. Roughly $50 billion to his name. Somewhere around the 35th richest person alive. Between late 2022 and the middle of 2025, Griffin's companies bought every unit in the Solaris. $125 million, an average of $875 per square foot, more than 20% above what comparable Brickell units were fetching. He overpaid on purpose, deliberately, consistently, for 3 years. And he did it because the Solaris was the last thing standing between him and 2 full city blocks. Griffin had been assembling 4.2 acres of Brickell for a $2.5 billion corporate campus, a 54-story global headquarters for Citadel and Citadel Securities. Where the Solaris stands, the plans call for 300 apartments and a garage with more than 1,400 parking spaces. The tower was never the asset. The dirt underneath it was. Now, the honest counter-argument, because there is a good one. Nobody at the Solaris was forced out. Not one owner was evicted, and no termination was ever filed. Griffin got to 100% the slow way, by raising his offers, until every single person said yes. The late holdouts walked away with roughly 3 times what Mark Clifton took in December 2022. By any normal measure, those were good outcomes. Redfin's chief economist has pointed out that developers routinely pay more for a condo termination than for an empty lot, because a unified site is worth far more than the sum of its apartments. All of that is true. And I still think the framing is wrong. That 20% premium was not generosity. It was the price of silence. Cheaper than a public fight, cheaper than a 54-story tower sitting in planning limbo, and vastly cheaper than the campus it unlocked. $125 million sounds enormous until you set it beside a $2.5 billion project. It is 5%. It is a rounding error with a lobby, and the word voluntary does a lot of quiet work in this story. Every owner did choose. They chose while a statute sat in the background, making the alternative worse, while their neighbors vanished one by one, and while the person on the other side of the table knew exactly how the board looked and they did not. That is not a market. That is a symmetry wearing a market's clothes. And every person signing those papers was negotiating over a building that was never going to survive the deal. There's a footnote to all of this that I cannot stop thinking about. On the same assemblage, there is a small historic cottage. It was once the office of Miami's first physician. Today, it houses the Dade Heritage Trust, and it belongs to the city. In July 2026, Griffin moved to buy it for around $3 million. A man who took 138 apartments without anyone learning his name cannot take this one quietly. Because it is public property, and public property has to be sold in public, in front of commissioners, on the record, with people watching. 138 private owners could be approached one at a time, in the dark, with no idea what anyone else was being paid. A single public building cannot. That contrast is the whole lesson. The Solaris did not fall because its owners were foolish or greedy. It fell because they were isolated, and isolation is the cheapest thing a buyer can purchase. Ownership feels like control right up until the moment somebody with enough capital decides they want your address. Then you find out what you actually own is a position in someone else's negotiation. Mark Clifton sold too early. His neighbors held on and tripled it. So here's the question I would put to you. Was Clifton robbed, or did he simply misread the market like anyone can? Those are very different answers, and which one you pick says a lot about what you believe ownership really is. Tell me in the comments. Everything in this video comes from public records and reporting, and I have put the sources in the description. This is not financial advice, and please do your own due diligence. The Solaris is still standing as of today. 138 empty apartments, 22 floors of nobody, waiting for a demolition permit. And somewhere in Miami, there is another ordinary building on extraordinary land, where the first letter has already gone out, and the people inside have absolutely no idea what is happening to them yet.